have to ask you, so obviously you've been around wrestling for a while, and how and where did you find wrestling, and in what way could you say it kind of impacted your life?
Yeah, yeah, no, good question. So, I grew up in New York. My twin brother and I grew up in New York, and I remember going out for the basketball team when we were in 8th grade. And if you saw us now, we're no bit more than 5'5", max. So we're tiny tykes. I remember getting cut from the basketball team in 8th grade, and one of our buddies said, "Hey, why don't you try wrestling?" And it didn't take long for us to gravitate towards that sport. Just the intensity level, the combative nature of it, the hand-to-hand. We were always roughhousing as kids. I mean, I always joke in that Phil and I were wrestling before we ever started wrestling. I remember getting into a fight when I was in elementary school and hitting a double leg on a kid and not knowing what a double leg was. So it is 100% shaped our lives and continues to do so, even with me not being heavily involved daily. I still feel the residuals of being a wrestler and being a coach. It's still very impactful.
Right. I mean, I always think it's a sport where once you get into it, it just never, the tendencies never leave you, and makes things a little bit easier down the road too.
Oh, all right. So you can look at it and be like, whether you come across your buddies who wrestled, whether you're saying hi to a buddy who's never wrestled, it always includes some sort of arm drag, some sort of passing by an elbow, whether you have kids, and then you start to roughhouse and play wrestle with your kids. Me being a counselor in elementary school, we have a ton of kids who belong to clubs all throughout Chattanooga.
Right.
So there's so many talking points I have with those kids. I don't think I've ever desired for the sport to escape me. It couldn't, even if I tried, especially now with the onset of, for these, not current onset, but it's been going on for years. Just UFC has created so much more awareness to cauliflower ear. So you see a combative athlete, you see a hand-to-hand guy, and you just gravitate towards that individual. There's this bond and connectedness that exists within the wrestling community and hand-to-hand sports, but particularly, I believe, within the wrestling community, that is just second to none.
Oh yeah, no. And you mentioned the UFC, and I really think that, and my coach as well, and I've talked about this, it's really brought a new popularity to the sport in the past decade or so, just because it's just people realize, oh, I think this is entertaining to watch, and it's also one of the easiest sports to get a hold of in that collection of styles.
Yeah, they've done wonders, I think, for the sport and just driving attention forward and creating an additional avenue for an athlete when they are finished with either high school or college wrestling and they desire to pursue something on a higher level. And I just think the amount of opportunities it has created has been great.
No, I agree with that 100%. And I think if anything, the sport's going to go up from here with the influence that mixed martial arts has had. Now, kind of switching gears a little bit. So you finished out your high school career. You're from Middletown, New York. You finished out as a 2-time New York State champ, and then you made the move down to Cleveland State. What made you want to choose that to continue your academic and wrestling career?
Yeah, so for us, my brother and I, my sister, I grew up with a dad that was somewhat distant, so I didn't see him often, certainly not on a daily or weekly basis. So for my brother and I, the choice to attend Cleveland State was very much based on one of my coach's influences in my life. So when we were juniors and seniors in Middletown, New York, and we were training for a state title, we would go to the Black Knights Wrestling Club, which was housed out of West Point, New York. And what made it so amazing was this was like, it housed all of the region's really tough wrestlers, and we all came to this one place. It was very different than how it is somewhat in Chattanooga. Chattanooga is very, you'll have your Saudi club, and then your Hickson club, and then your Red Bank, and then your Macaulay and Baylor, and your Boyd and your CCS. They're very compartmentalized, whereas at least 20, 25 years ago, where we grew up in New York, everybody would come to this central location and everybody would train. There was massive value in that because we were continually seeing high-level athletes from all their schools. Some of those athletes we would compete against in the tournaments and the finals and the semis. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the coaches of the Black Knights Wrestling Club was Jack Effner, who was the head coach at West Point. And for my brother and I, we always gravitated towards a very strong male figure. My high school coach was very influential in our lives as well, Paul Cummings. Part of the reason why is Paul, my high school coach, and Jack Effner, my college coach, they drew a definitive line for me as an athlete and as a person. I didn't get that from my dad. So they drew a line, and they very much held me accountable to that line, whether it was my work ethic, showing up on time, being late, staying after, making weight, doing everything right. There was the line, and I had to meet that line. For me, that parental figure, that father figure, was massively influential in our decision to go to Cleveland State. If you look back at that time period, Cleveland State was somewhat on the not necessarily decline, but they were struggling, and we were exploring a ton of other colleges. But something about Jack played a massively important father figure in our lives. He was an amazing mentor to I and my brother. And when I look back at my experience at college, I now look back and go, how I perceive Jack is very much as close to a father figure as my own dad. So he was the person that we needed at that moment in our lives. He was a hard dude. And let's just say I only was late to practice one time. After that, it didn't take much from him, but I feared being late after that.
Well, I think that influence, especially in a sport like this, where you're really exposed to so much adversity at an early age. I think that type of influence is very important for growth, past wrestling, because I think, there's winning, but after you take off your shoes and you leave the sport, a lot of people, even that you met through wrestling, are going to remember you for the person you were as opposed to what you did on that.
Yeah, no, it's crazy you say that, because I think I've probably said this 1,000 times since I've jumped into the counseling world. If every child had to do a hand-to-hand sport, now I especially gravitate towards wrestling, but whatever you have, taekwondo, jujitsu, if every child had to do a hand-to-hand sport, the amount of humility, love, respect, confidence, grit. But I think at the forefront of that is humility and respect. When we have that amount of humility and respect for another human, I think it often changes how we view that human. And I think it reshapes our heart in a massively positive way. I wish more and more kids did it. Of course, it's a growing sport. I love the onset of girls wrestling. I just think that's amazing. It's a gift. Wrestling 100% is a gift. Is it hard? For sure. For sure. Are there parts of me that think we are often afraid to challenge kids in that way? Yeah, I think we have to be a little bit more balanced in how we do it, but there's natural elements to the sport of wrestling that cannot be ignored. And those natural elements, I think, are the gift that makes life just a touch more easier and a bit more manageable, in my opinion.
Oh, I agree. Dan Gable said it best, that after wrestling, everything's a lot easier. And
except parenting. You don't know that yet, but dude, parenting is the one thing that will challenge that statement.
No, I mean, 100%. Now you mentioned the Black Knights Wrestling Club, which kind of sets up my next question, because you're talking about the exposure that you got while in that club. So when you made the switch to college wrestling, and after making the move west, what was it like just adopting that college wrestling environment?
Yeah, well, I think everybody's a little bit different. For me personally, I can't talk about my brother. I could only talk about my personal experience. For my personal experience, it was definitely a learning curve. So yes, we trained at a high level in high school, but when you step in any Division I college program, the reality is most programs you can't escape. Most programs, there's someone there that's just as tough, if not tougher. So the competitiveness of a Division I college room, regardless of where it's at, for most kids does take you back. The level of training ups, but it's not just the training. The reality is everything else has to matter. And it took me 100%, it took me 2 to 3 years to create a very balanced life. When we were in high school, we were very sheltered. We were very sport focused.
Right.
We didn't deviate from the plan. We had very little social life. So to take an individual that had very little exposure to his peer group, to the opposite sex, to nightlife, to being independent, being on their own, in charge of their academics, in charge of making good choices on a Friday night. You take someone like me who's had limited exposure or practice in those areas, and then you send me to a big city like Cleveland. It 100% took at least 2 years for me to settle in and say, okay, I can't just show up to practice and give it my all.
Right.
I have to do everything else right. I have to eat right. I have to prioritize my academics. My sleep schedule's got to be on point. I got to spend time recovering. I got to do ice baths. I got to stretch. I got to cut weight properly. I think the amount of education now for high school athletes is much greater, but I also think you look across the board, there are some incredible high school coaches. Chattanooga alone has, in my opinion, some of the best high school coaches in the country, let alone we even have some of the best youth coaches in the country just in the area of Chattanooga. So the amount of education that goes into the sport, the amount of expertise, I think kids are being guided in a much earlier way. I mean, as far as how to properly train and take care of yourself. 20, 25 years ago, you still had athletes who were multiple sport athletes. Nowadays, you have a lot of the specialized athletes who are doing this year round. We were right at the cusp of that specialization where Fargo and training freestyle and Greco and having a fall club and doing this year round. We were right at the beginning of that. Nowadays it seems like if you are not specialized, you are somewhat at a disadvantage, which breaks my heart to a degree. But wrestling at the collegiate level was for sure an adjustment for me. I would assume it's an adjustment for a lot of kids.
Well, I would agree. The stories, at least I've heard, is, you hear about the classic story that in high school, especially if you're coming out as a top recruit, you could literally walk into a college room, go from being able to do whatever you wanted in practice, not being able to land a takedown in the first 2 months. And I think, honestly, that's where, in my opinion, some of the best improvement comes from. Because it showed people have to go back down to being where they had to figure it out. Like in the high school room, say you're coming in as a freshman, you got to figure out how to go hard in practice, go the extra mile to get those takedowns and get the reps and really embrace the grind. So you get to go back and do a little bit more homework, say the least.
Yeah. Now, Here's a really good question to ask. And if I had to go back and do it again, of course, every athlete, I've never met a single athlete who was fully content with their experience.
Mhm.
But if I had to go back and do it again, I would 100% become more of a student of the sport, but not just a student of the sport, a student of everything, of what my diet
Right.
looked like, what my recovery looked like, almost like a science, almost looking at it from an observer's view and taking a lot of notes and seeing what works and what doesn't work. Even from a technical standpoint, I think I would have included a lot more play. I would have not so much looked at the style that my coach wanted me to chase, but the style that was maybe more authentic to who I was as a person. So
Right. Because I think it's always important to never lose touch, kind of what figuratively brought you to the dance. I mean, you always you always want to replicate, your own personality, and
mm,
but I agree with that 100%. Now,
yeah, I think what brought me to the dance was being a pissed off little kid.
well, I mean, the determination, some people they get that just tunnel vision mentality, and road is endless for them, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So after finishing out your college career at Cleveland State, you went into a coaching career. You started out as a graduate assistant at John Carroll, and then after a little while there, you made the way back to New York and started coaching at West Point. And then after a little while there, you made the move down south, obviously the scenic city, and joined a pretty legendary coaching staff. But what made you come back and begin coaching at Army, and what also made you want to make the move down south to begin coaching for UTC?
Yeah. So I remember graduating in 2006 I had a graduate degree in school counseling. So John Carroll is a great competitive D3 school outside of Cleveland, Ohio. And it's a small little Jesuit school, but they have some really good competitive wrestlers. And they're always in a top 10, top 15 every year. And we had a few All-Americans. We had a pretty solid team. And I remember after graduate school, I went right into being a school counselor.
Mhm.
I was at Cape Henry Collegiate School, which is an amazing college preparatory school in Virginia Beach. And I probably didn't realize how amazing it was at that particular age. But I remember coaching there for 2 years, and I just kept feeling like I didn't know enough.
Mhm.
I think that uneasiness of there's more information, I need to chase more information, I need to expand, I need to grow, led me to pursue college coaching. Now, looking back, there was more than enough opportunities for me to expand at Cape Henry. I think we give a lot of college coaches a lot of credit, but some of the best coaches out there, I believe, are coaching at the youth, middle, and high school levels.
Right.
Just the relationships they foster with their kids, the connectedness, the longevity and the growth of it, and just seeing a kid all the way through. Some coaches are seeing kids from tiny tykes all the way through their high school career, which says a lot about them. But that uneasiness when I was at Cape Henry led me to pursue a assistant coaching position at West Point. And West Point was amazing. I'm a very type A individual. I like order, and I like systematic. I love their recruiting system. It was a funnel theory, right? At a place like UTC, based on their admission standards, you could recruit many kids throughout the country. At a place like West Point, because their admission standards were so strict, it created this funnel theory that actually, in my opinion, made recruiting a little bit easier at West Point. So West Point, I started realizing that I like the business side of coaching. I like the recruiting.
Yeah.
I like the camp systems. I like the organizational skills. Chuck Barbie was my mentor at West Point, and even though I was only under Chuck for 1 year before Heath called and I came down to UTC, I look at Chuck as a very formative individual, because he was a very, very strong figure in that he held us accountable as a staff. We met every single Monday. We had to discuss recruits. We had to talk about where kids were in the process. Who do we have in the pipeline? What kids are on unofficial, official visits? What plans we have coming up? He very much held us accountable to our job. So I have even taken that, and even on Mondays in my current field of counseling, we have weekly meetings and that we discuss student needs. So even though I was only at West Point for a year, my brain probably was designed for an institution like that. Of course, It was close to home for me. So being close to my family was super important. But, when Coach Esslinger, who I absolutely love, Heath, called and we visited Chattanooga, something about it just resonated. And we've been here at Chattanooga ever since 2009. And I only coached there through 13, but the plan wasn't to stay in Chattanooga as long as we have. Now that we're here, we probably have more family members in Chattanooga than you do right now.
Oh, well, like I said, we're lucky to, like you mentioned earlier about Chattanooga being exposed to a lot of really, good talent and people who have a lot of knowledge about the sport. And like I mentioned earlier, you and your brother, and you have like Michael Sutherland, Mike Hatcher, and the coaching staff. You're working, like you said, with Heath Esslinger and Mike Hatcher himself, and you had Josh Lambrick in there for a little while. But you also have a lot of coaches that are branching out to, like you mentioned earlier, the youth, the middle, the high school. You got Josh Edmondson, Wrestle for UTC, who's helping in high school. You got Houston Clements, just a little bit of a shout out. A lot of guys that have a lot of, I think, underrated knowledge that are also want the best for the wrestlers beyond the mat. And I think that's an important part. So after you finished out your college career, all in all, just what was it like, and what's one of your biggest takeaways from it?
As a competitor or as a coach?
As a coach.
Yeah. Man, what took me out of college coaching was in 2012, I had a full hip replacement. And, college coaching, if you look around the college coaching scene, you see a lot of coaches who are still able to get on the mat and compete at a super high level.
Right.
I think my biggest value to the sport was always an organizational and business side of it. It was the recruiting systems. It was the organizational system. It was running the camp system. It was, fundraising. It was building connections with our alumni base. So when I look back at college coaching and I say, what did I enjoy the most? College coaching is very much, in my opinion, like running a small company, in that you have to be able to do a lot of things really, really well. Now, one of them is the development side of coaching. So the hard part about the development side of coaching is it's so much of that time is in the room. Yeah. Looking back, if I would have known what I know now, my body has recovered significantly well with my hip replacement. I probably would have stayed in coaching for a significant amount of time. If I better understood that I could be just as impactful on the side, running a kid through a series of techniques. Coach Hatcher does an amazing job of this. You alluded to some of the coaches we have here in Chattanooga. There are some amazing youth, Shane Rabbit and Sutherland, you mentioned. Middle school, we have so many amazing coaches, and Yost and Pitts. There's so many, and Boskin and Joey Knox. It's ridiculous. I look at Chattanooga and I look at it as Cleveland, Ohio is a hotbed for wrestling. Pittsburgh is a hotbed for wrestling. Jersey, North Jersey, Long Island is a hotbed for wrestling. There are these hot pockets in the country that are a hotbed for wrestling. I look at Chattanooga as one of those hotbeds. I think people underestimate the amount of talent that's in this area from a coaching standpoint.
Oh yeah.
And, it was really cool to see that. I certainly miss it. But, the sport continues to play a massive, massive role in my life. And I still feel like I'm riding the wave of my competition days in high school and college. And, I'll still get on the mat maybe once a week now.
Mhm.
I think I have so many other interest areas. That's probably where my brain wants to stay.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily interested in getting back full time, but I can't imagine it not continuing to be a very important part of my life moving forward, especially with me having children and just helping kids along the way.
Right. And you mentioned the clubs and everything like that. And you mentioned Chattanooga being a hot spot for wrestling, which I completely agree with. Because I think, in my personal opinion, for the state of Tennessee, you look at, say, they have the state tournament up in Nashville.
Mhm.
And I'm one of the heavy advocates for them to bring the state tournament back to McKenzie Arena.
I
Just
would love
solely
that.
because, I mean, all your local fans, and you could look back at 2004, 2005, 6, up until they moved it in about 2012. You had fans that they didn't even have anybody competing in it, but they were still showing up to watch. It's like how many? It's like the Southern Scuffle, the crowd they draw in. There's just such a base of wrestling. Like you look at Soddy Daisy, they love their wrestling. You know, Signal Mountain, Baylor, all those areas. And if anything, the influence is growing more because we have new clubs coming in. Like you look at most recently, the one that's really catapulting is the MTC, the Minion Training Center, and you have 3 very expertise coaches there. You got
Mhm.
Sean Russell, Cody Russell, Shane Turner. You have Shane Chittum as well, and
Yeah,
that
and I
group.
think, yeah, I think the one thing that the Minion Training Club, the Minion Training Center could do is, so the one difference that I see from at now up north might have changed a little bit in how it manages its club system, but like for an example, New Jersey, you'd have the Edge, you'd have the New Jersey Athletic Club, and it would be this collection of just local kids.
Right.
And it is so compartmentalized in Chattanooga with Boyd and McCauley and Baylor and CCS and everyone having their own mini club system. I do believe that MTSC could be that housing for a collection of kids from all different clubs to come in and train. And of course, being the university, my hope is they continue to run that out of the university. I'm not sure if they will, but having a Division I school in your neighborhood certainly would make that a little bit easier. I know Coach Hatcher tried to do that when he was here at UTC, and it was hard. I think the way kids jump around nowadays. A lot of coaches are fearful of recruiting and losing athletes, which I totally understand. So you want to house those needs in house. I get that as well. But there's certainly not a shortage of clubs within this area.
Oh, 100%. You mentioned bringing in kind of like a diverse group, from all over, and I think I agree with you in that standpoint. They are doing a great job of that because, as someone who personally does train there as well, there are people from Georgia dropping in, Alabama, um, everything, dropping in for this club, and it's bringing in such a diverse group of talent as well.
Mm-hmm.
And iron sharpens iron, in my opinion. So that
Yeah,
I think they're on something great there.
I agree.
Kind of wrapping things up a little bit. All in all, what advice would you give to someone who's pursuing wrestling and is looking to go as far as they would like to go in the sport?
Man, that's a good question. That's a big question. So to go as far as they can in this sport. Okay. There's a few answers that I have to that. So wrestling is a massively competitive sport. It's naturally a very, very difficult sport. So, you know, there's going to be at times where wrestling feels forced, where you feel like you are forced to go to practice, or your parent is strongly suggesting that you go to practice, and is just really trying to pressure you, and your coaches are asking you for more and more and more. I think the biggest thing is knowing that there will always be pockets of that in your life where you feel pressure. My biggest suggestion is try as an athlete to take ownership of your growth, right? So the older you get, the more independence you have. I think the more an athlete starts to study what works for them and what doesn't work for them, even their personality type, like my personality type, do I resonate with a short arms, heavy hands, square stance, Iowa style wrestling, which is shifting too? Do I resonate with outside the box, a lot of fakes, a lot of motion, counterattacks? Where does my brain resonate? Do I like grinding on top? Do I like taking risk? Like, I think we have to learn how to take ownership of our wrestling and start to look at ourselves as this scientific experiment, and what works and what doesn't work. And how do you go into a wrestling room and have this creative brain, this lightness on your shoulders, to look at this as an incubator of growth, and that growth over time is massively, massively substantial. You know, what makes that so difficult is that there are times the wrestling room is exhausting, and it 100% feels like work, and it doesn't feel like play. This is why I believe having a creative, playful mind and looking at your development and taking complete ownership of that, and that includes your academics, that includes your diet, that includes what you're doing on a Friday night, that includes your recovery, that includes your yoga session or your cold plunge, that includes your days off, right? We are finally out of that mindset of running through a wall. Clearly that doesn't work, right? The body could break down very quickly. So learning to take ownership over your training, how to advocate for yourself, how to be able to communicate and articulate to your coach what you might think is best for you while still understanding their view. And how do you have this relationship with your coach where it's not always a top down, someone telling you what to do, but you get on this level and you are both committed to this growth and this development. I think that is massively important. I hope that certainly makes sense. My brain, I think maybe that's what I yearn for. But looking at the athletes that I've coached, I think the ones who had complete ownership and knew exactly what worked for them, and what they needed that particular day, always seem to achieve at a higher level than the ones who are always fighting it, or were just doing what they were told. That makes sense.
No, I agree 100%. Those two last things you mentioned, about taking ownership and then being able, as a coach and as a wrestler, to meet kind of in the middle and exchange constructive criticism and be able to, go off that. And I also think that the wrestlers who are able to say they have a match that doesn't go their way, if they're able to look back and they're willing to look back and problem solve and say, hey, this is what I need to fix, and kind of meet their coach in the middle and be coachable in a sense.
Yes. Well, that's huge. And there's elements of dropping your ego. You have to have a really amazing relationship with your coach for that to happen. And to understand, the older we get, the more we start to understand and learn about ourselves and what works for us and what doesn't work for us. So it's hard to have that mindset as a youth or as a middle school coach, because typically the coach is going to know what's best for you and what works. But as we get older, we start to learn and grow and better understand ourselves and better understand the sport. So if you want to do this for an extended period of time, I think you have to have that mindset that is always absorbing and desiring to learn, and doesn't take themselves too seriously, isn't always on, because that doesn't always work either, knows when they get heavy, knows when they get light, knows when to press, knows when to scale back. Because the reality is sometimes coaches are so competitive, we always want to press.
Right.
And that's probably one of my failures as a coach. Well, as we get older as an athlete, we start to realize, wait, my body's telling me I need to scale. Well, when you get to college, you need to have a good enough relationship with your coach that says, look, man, my body's aching today. I think I need a good drill bout. I think I need a good 20, 30-minute drill, one match, and then I'm hitting the ice bath, as opposed to a 2.5-hour grind. So once you get to that level, I think you can advocate for yourself and build that relationship with your college coach. 100%. 100%. Is it hard to do that in high school? Yeah, for sure it is. Most kids don't get past high school.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you're competing at a higher level, and I think most of the coaches in the country will tell you they became 10 times better wrestlers once they started coaching.
Right. No.
Once they started breaking things down, not just from a technical aspect, but to see all the different layers that go into coaching and what it means to feel good on that particular day.
100%. I think it really opens a mindset where you're able to, you know what you know, but you're able to retain a lot more knowledge and kind of build off that knowledge, because, knowledge leads to the foundations of success, knowledge and experience, in my opinion. So all around, I think that just really ties back to how much of an impact the sport can have on people, and that it can be, really, it could be somewhere people could look back 30 years from now and think, I don't know where I'd be without this sport. But
Mason, what's crazy? I'm not kidding, man. I'm not kidding. One, if I didn't have my twin brother built in, I'm not sure I would have succeeded or at least gone as far as I did. And in my brain, I didn't go as far as I desired. Even when I leave Publix, the grocery store, I have to literally walk my cart, put it all the way back. And if I see 4 or 5 carts out of place, I put those back. That comes from wrestling, because you cannot succeed in wrestling without doing these other little things really good. And I think your brain focuses on, this is the right thing to do. I can't cut corners. I can't show up late. I can't leave early. I can't miss on my diet. And it's those little things. Now, does that create a perfectionist type A mentality that could get overextended at times? For sure. But it's certainly something. I'd rather tame a lion than beat a lamb. And even little things like that were cultivated from the sport of wrestling, in my world, at least.
100% agree, and likewise as well. Well, thank you for joining me. I appreciate it. It's been a blast, and hope you have a good night as well. And
yeah,
thank you. And it was great talking to you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me.